the Jesus family tomb is to be believed, then why would the Catholic Church lie about it? Why would the Catholic Church not talk about the son of Jesus or the wife of Jesus? Why would they not mention these things? And essentially, the Catholic Church has been lying for many centuries. The Catholic Church versus science. Now, it's not clear-cut and dry. The Catholic Church has a public relations department, so they want to get the word out. But just, think of Galileo. Galileo says that the entire universe, the galaxy or the solar system revolved around the sun, and not everything was, it wasn't heliocentric. The Earth wasn't the center of the universe. And so he was right. He was 100% right about how the planets and the solar system all aligned. It wasn't geocentric, but heliocentric. So, all the planets revolve around the sun, which, they didn't know about that. In fact, Aristotle thought that the planets and the sun all revolved in perfect circles around the Earth. The Earth was the center. But, clearly that isn't true. The closest star to us is over 4 light years away, called Proxima Centauri, and it's a small red dwarf star, but that's every star in the galaxy could have planets circling them and life on those planets. And when I look up, I see, thousands of stars, and they're not very close. 4 light years. It would take 10,000 years for a ship of today's technology to reach Proxima Centauri, and that's the closest one. So the history of the Catholic Church isn't always good when it comes to the Catholic Church had produced Georges, Henry Joseph, Edouard Lemaitre. Lemaitre. So Georges. So Father Lemaitre, he was a Belgian priest, astronomer, professor of physics at the Catholic University of Leuven. He proposed what became known as the Big Bang theory of the origin of the universe, which he called his hypothesis of the primeval atom, or the cosmic egg. So that is the Catholic Church. That's the Catholic Church. That was a priest, Lemaitre, Lemaitre. So Father Lemaitre, a Belgian priest, actually come up with the theory of the Big Bang. The Big Bang, right? In the Big Bang and God's supposed to be incompatible. According to Father Lemaitre, who died in 1966, it was not. So that's one good thing. It's one good piece of candy in the Catholic Church. The history of the Catholic Church, at least if you were to listen to them, they said it begins with the teachings of Jesus. So Jesus was the first Catholic. He preached in the 1st century AD in the province of Judea of the Roman Empire. The contemporary Catholic Church says it is the continuation of the early Christian community established by Jesus. Its bishops are the successors to the apostles of Jesus, and the Bishop of Rome, also known as the Pope, is the sole successor to St. Peter, who was appointed by Jesus Christ to be head of the church in the New Testament, who ministered in Rome. Now that's fascinating. St. Peter ran away. St. Peter, when he was crucified, St. Peter, ran away from Jesus' attackers and arresters. And then he also denied Jesus 3 times. This is the man the entire church is built around. Man who had denied Jesus 3 times, ran away when he was arrested. You know who didn't run away? Mary Magdalene. Mary Magdalene stayed by Jesus' side. Shaking my head. Is that actually, is that a thing when people say shaking my head? It's supposed to, it's disapproval, right? But is that like, oh my God, he just shook his head at me. What shall I do? So you don't approve of what? This truth I'm dropping on you? So Christianity, so they say St. Peter was the rock upon which the church was built upon, and then the Catholic Church essentially takes that as their authority for why they do the things that they do today. They have absolute authority when it comes to matters of religion and spirituality, and they took that pretty serious. In the beginning, they were just a religion, but eventually the Roman Empire adopts them into the empire. So that happened in So in 1313, the struggles of the early church were lessened by the legalization of Christianity by Emperor Constantine. Constantine said, let's be tolerant. He had the Council of Nicaea. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth. In 380, under Emperor Theodosius I, Christianity became the state religion of the Roman Empire by the decree of the emperor, which would persist until the fall of the Western Empire and later with the Eastern Roman Empire until the fall of Constantinople. So, this is Theodosius. Emperor Theodosius eventually, the Romans killed Jesus, and then the Romans adopted Christianity as the state religion. So if you weren't Christian, eventually you're going to get executed. You're going to get murdered. And the Council of Nicaea was very clever because they took all these pagan origins, right, of Santa Claus and Easter Bunny, not Santa Claus, but Easter Bunny, and sort of Thor with the flying deer. And then you had a lot of inquisitions. You had the Roman Inquisition, you had the Medieval Inquisition, you had the Catholic Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, the Portuguese Inquisition. And all these inquisitions were essentially finding people and rooting them out if they were not Catholic. Are you a Catholic? I don't know. It doesn't sound like you're doing very good Catholic things. And you would be jailed or exiled or even killed. There are several times that they actually killed somebody. This would be Robert Bellarmine, Giordano Bruno, Giordano, or Filippo Bruno. Mr. Bruno. Mr. Bruno was an Italian Dominican friar, philosopher, mathematician, poet, astrologer. So he's a friar. He's a religious man, Catholic, but he was killed. And why? Because several of the core doctrines, this Giordano Bruno, Mr. Bruno, is going to be one of the first people that is going to be murdered for his belief in science. There is this conflict thesis that says that science and the Catholic Church are not compatible. And they've been making some changes. They have actually been modernizing themselves, and good for them. The Protestants aren't any better. Protestants act like Catholics while at the same time saying that the Catholic Church is the Antichrist. But they organize themselves. They got bishops and leaders, and they have bread and wine, except for they have grape juice and, I don't know. They do everything. The church is weird to begin with, but they, take it and make it weirder. They got speaking of the tongues, where they're, right? They're fucking talking into tongues. It's like, oh, no, this is God. This is what God sounds like when I use my native voice. Really? That's what God sounds like? Well, God. So Giordano Bruno is a martyr of science. He's one of the first people that died just because he sought to understand the universe. And, some people, it depends on who you're listening to. If you're listening to the church, it's because he, contradicted core Catholic teachings. But essentially, his theological beliefs, or at least the perceptions of his beliefs by others, were an important factor in his heresy trial. His Copernicanism and cosmological beliefs played a significant role in the outcome. So he believed in Copernicus. He believed that the sun was in the middle of the solar system and the planets revolved around the sun. Well, the Catholic Church just lost their fucking minds, just like they did with Galileo. Galileo, they warned him early in his life, and then later in his life he wrote the Dialogue Concerning Two Systems, something like that. And then they wound up trying him for heresy. Filippo Bruno, Giordano Bruno, Italian Dominican friar. He's celebrated for his cosmological theories, which went even further than the then novel Copernican model. He proposed that the stars were just distant suns surrounded by their own exoplanets, and raised the possibility that these planets could even foster life of their own, a philosophical position known as cosmic pluralism. He also insisted that the universe is in fact infinite and could have no celestial body at its center. So he says, not only was the sun the center of the solar system, but there is no center of the universe. It goes on for infinite, and then the stars are actually suns, and they have planets around them, and they could have life. He's right. So that's what he got fucking murdered for, because he was right. He said some shit that was right, but apparently it went against the Bible somehow. Beginning in 1593, Bruno was tried for heresy by the Roman Inquisition on charges including denial of several core Catholic doctrines, including the Trinity. right? 1 equals 3, 3 equals 1, the divinity of Christ, the virginity of Mary, right? She's a virgin, she never had sex. And transubstantiation. This wine and this bread really is the blood and body of Jesus. Now eat Jesus, you fucking cannibals. Bruno's pantheism was also a matter of grave concern. The Inquisition found him guilty, and in 1600 he was burned at the stake in Rome's Campo dei Fiori. After his death, he gained considerable fame, being particularly celebrated by the 19th and early 20th century commentators who regarded him as a martyr for science. Bruno's case is still considered a landmark in the history of free thought and the emerging sciences. In addition to cosmology, Bruno also wrote extensively on the art of memory, a loosely organized group. Giordano Bruno was born in Nola, Kingdom of Naples, 1548, and was killed February 17th, 1600. So on 2/17/1600, right, at the beginning of the new century, right, the new 17th century, they burned him. They burned him at the stake like a witch, just like the Salem witch trials, right? Where if a woman talked out of place or she had some spell that she would put over men, what could this spell be? How is she able to influence all of these men? They burned him at the stake. Now, he didn't just think about the astronomy. He also talked about mnemonic techniques. He was influenced by Arab astrology. He also had focused on a qualitative approach to mathematics and his application of the spatial concepts of geometry to language. So we should believed in a type of pantheism, and pantheism is the belief that the universe or nature is the totality of everything is identical with divinity, or that everything composes an all-encompassing immanent God. Pantheists thus do not believe in a distinct personal or anthropomorphic God, not an invisible man in the clouds. It's not even a human person, but essentially everything is God. All things is God. One is God. And I understand that, being one with one, being one with everything. We're all connected in this cosmic energy. We're all connected. I believe that, so I guess I'm a pantheist. And so is Bruno. Pantheistic concepts date back thousands of years, and some religions in the East continue to contain pantheistic elements. In the West, pantheism was formalized as a separate theology and philosophy based on the works of the 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza, whose work Ethics was an answer to Descartes' famous dualist theory that the body... I never give Spinoza much of credit for anything, but the fact that he is more of a pantheist, he's like the father of pantheism, even though he doesn't use the word, versus Descartes, who believed that there is the body and then there's the soul, and that they're two distinct things. But Spinoza said that, we're all connected, so it's actually the same thing. His book, Ethics, Spinoza's book, Ethics, was the answer to Descartes' famous dualist theory that the body and spirit are separate. Spinoza held the monist view that the two are the same thing, and monism is a fundamental part of his philosophy. He was described as a God-intoxicated man, and used the word God to describe the unity of all substance. That makes sense to me. I would say one energy, one love or something. Although the term pantheism was not coined until after his death, Spinoza is regarded as its most celebrated advocate. His work, Ethics, was a major source from which Western Copernicus himself didn't actually get a lot of the brunt of the Catholic Church's denial of the science. He essentially just said, I wonder if maybe the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Maybe the sun is the center of the solar system. Maybe we have a heliocentric solar system. So he only kind of postulated the theory and didn't go too far into it, so he didn't get much shit. And then actually his theory kind of stood around for quite some time. It wasn't until Bruno and Galileo when the church started to actually really hit him back. It was like 3 years later, there was a response written to Copernicanism, and so Copernicanism was the big, coin word of the big evil for the Catholic Church. In 1633, Galilei is going to be found guilty, and the sentence of the Inquisition is issued on June 22nd, 1633, and it was in essentially... So, number one, Galileo was found vehemently suspect of heresy, namely of having held the opinions that the sun lies motionless at the center of the universe, that the earth is not at the center and moves, and that one may hold and defend an opinion as probable after it has been declared contrary to Holy Scripture. He was required to abjure, curse, and detest those opinions. He was sentenced to formal imprisonment at the pleasure of the Inquisition. On the following day, this was commuted to house arrest, which he remained under for the rest of his life. His offending dialogue was banned, and in an action not announced at the trial, publication of any of his works were forbidden, including any he might write in the future. And there's actually a whole list. There's a whole list, the Index of Forbidden Works, the Index Librorum Prohibitorium. It's all the things that the Catholic Church banned from anybody reading. In fact, I think that might be the first. The Roman Inquisition tried Galileo in 1633, found him vehemently suspect of heresy, sentenced him to indefinite imprisonment, and he was kept under house arrest until his death in 1642. So for the last 10 years of his life, Galileo was under house arrest in prison, right? There was threats of torture, but when it comes, compared to Bruno, Galileo wasn't murdered. He wasn't killed. Eventually, the Catholic Church would apologize, or actually, I heard Pope Benedict had defended it. He was like, I don't know, Galileo was kind of an asshole. It's like, what? Galileo, where he come up with his ideas was he just made this really cheap little telescope. He saw the phases of Venus and the Galilean moons of Jupiter, and then with these observations, he promoted the heliocentric theory of Nicholas Copernicus, published in De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. In 1616, Galileo went on to propose a theory of tides, and of comets in 1619, he argued that the tides were evidence for the motion of the earth. And so he actually kind of jumped the gun with that one. So that's the problem with censorship and trying to suppress knowledge. You have Tesla, Nikola Tesla. And Nikola Tesla, he postulated on lots of ideas. He's got lots of theories. And just because you have a theory about something doesn't necessarily make it true. In fact, there's a huge argument right now between gravity versus quantum mechanics. Which one is true? They're not, they're exclusive. They're not compatible with each other. So eventually one of them has to be right and one of them has to be wrong. But they both have had practical applications. And that's usually, right, the proof is in the pudding if there's practical applications. So maybe there's a quantum mechanic theory of gravity. Maybe those two theories can combine somehow. Galileo was Catholic. And so when the whole thing between the Catholic Church versus science, they actually point out that Galileo was a Catholic, so he's one of ours. Well, then why'd you fucking put him under house arrest and embarrass him and suppress his work for such a fucking long time? So that just shows me that they will bend the fucking ideas to conform to their conclusions. Well, that's not how science and truth works. Either something is true or it is not. And, Aristotle's views were considered radical at one point in Europe, but then they become the conservative point of view. And like Francis Bacon, Galileo was opposed to Aristotelian ideology. Galileo was interested in the mechanics of motion, and he was at odds with Aristotelian professors talking of things sinking or floating according to their will or essential natures, and of things fallen because they wanted to return home, as if the inanimate contained a spirit and will. Galileo had grasped the idea of force as mechanical. You started to have this scientific thinking, all these people saying, well, what if the church is wrong about all these questions and matters of science? They want to have a monopoly on morality, but they also want to have a monopoly on all the truth. And if they know it all, then that means you don't need to learn anything. Just shut your mouth and do as you're told. The Index Librorum Prohibitorium, this is the list of prohibited books. The Catholic Church had a list of prohibited books. The first version was promulgated by Pope Paul IV in 1559. He believed marked the turning point for freedom of inquiry in the Catholic world, and it lasted less than a year, beginning then replaced by what was called the Tridentine Index. So, but this, the 20th and final edition of the list of prohibited books appeared in 1948. So it continued till 1948. There's a 20th edition. And if you want to start, the list of truth, you probably should start. It tells me you cannot read this book because of A, B, C, or D. You cannot read Huckleberry Finn because it's got the word, the nigger, right? The nigger word, the N nigger word was all over the place. And so that's why you shouldn't be able to read it, but it's considered, quintessentially American. One of the greatest, probably the greatest American novel, Huckleberry Finn. And we're not allowed to read it. Okay, so that's eventually the list of prohibited books is abolished on June 14th, 1966 by Pope Paul VI, but there's 20 editions. Get a hold of that 20th and final edition, and you'll see what ideas the Catholic Church did not want you to know about. And essentially, it seems like it's science, and it's about the planets. And Johann Kepler's Epitome Astronomiae Copernicani was on the index from 1621 to 1835. And then Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason was also on. Who were these authors that the Catholic Church said to the people of Europe, you cannot read these books? Well, there's a bunch of them. I mean, even Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which kills the Enlightenment, stops the Enlightenment, because he's thinking, well, there's limits to pure reason, so we can't learn everything, and people have different perspectives, so fuck it all. And I think Immanuel Kant, I don't know how you're actually supposed to say it. I don't know if that's a joke or not. But I heard that Kant is actually supposed to be pronounced Kant. Anyways, Kepler's New Astronomy, his Epitome of Copernican Astronomy, his World of Harmony. Johann Kepler, scientist, was placed on the index. Other ones were Jean-Paul Sartre, Montaigne, Voltaire, Denis Diderot, Victor Hugo, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, André Gide, Emanuel Swedenborg, Baruch Spinoza, Immanuel Kant, David Hume, René Descartes, Francis Bacon. Through some of these names again, actually I'll go the opposite way. Charles Darwin was never put on the list of prohibited books, but you did have Hugo Grotius, Blaise Pascal, Galileo Galilei, Nicholas Copernicus, John Locke, John Milton, Thomas Brown, Francis Bacon, René Descartes, David Hume, Immanuel Kant. Which is interesting. John Locke, that's the founding fathers, right? The right to liberty, life, and property, which we changed to pursuit of happiness, but that's a cornerstone of what, governments are supposed to protect, our personal freedoms and liberties. And so we wouldn't have America if we would have listened to the Catholic Church. And so, this makes me think of Dan Brown. Dan Brown, he had wrote 2 books. One was The Da Vinci Code, and then on angels and demons. And he's a fictional writer, so his books aren't true, but he presents his Angels and Demons book. Dan Brown postulates that the Illuminati was formed as a counter movement to the church's smashing of, free inquiry and scientific thought. You can't fuck with the scientific revolution. Once you let that, genie out of the bottle, that the sun is the center of the solar system and not the earth is at the center of the entire universe. Once you let that, genie out of the bottle, it's kind of hard to go back to believing that the world is flat and, all the other dumb shit that the people of yesteryear used to believe. When you look at these authors, Voltaire, there's the age of Voltaire. Denis Diderot wrote the Encyclopedia. Victor Hugo, famous author, I want to say Les Miserables, but I'm not sure, but, he's done some shit. Jean-Jacques Rousseau, my fucking favorite of the Enlightenment thinkers. Spinoza, we just mentioned about him. David Hume, and René Descartes. René Descartes actually was killed by the Catholic Church too, which I'm going to get to here in a second. But and I'm going to get to some other people that the Catholic Church has killed. They killed just because they were scientific thinkers. You think in science, well, now you got to fucking die. They took Bruno and they burned him at the stake. They burned Bruno at the stake. They even burned John Hughes. John Hughes was the sort of a Protestant, but he read the Bible and he says that I'm going to interpret the Bible for myself. Well, the Catholic Church says, well, you got to fucking die, and they burned him at the stake too. So he was sort of open to inquiry, right? He kind of opened that door to thinking for yourself. There was the Hughesite Wars, which lasted for like 100 years. They were so pissed off that they would just fucking kill somebody like this. And so the way that they treated Galileo actually was a little bit smarter, because you create a martyr. You create a martyr when you kill somebody. And so they let him live, but under house. Valentine's Day in 2010, you had an author, an academic author, who basically went back and saw what happened with Descartes and said that he was murdered. He was killed. It didn't make any sense, the circumstances surrounding his death. There was a couple presidents that actually died by poisoning. Somebody ate cherries and ate some milk, and then that wound up killing them. And you could find out, right? You could pull up his body and see if you got arsenic in his stomach. But Descartes died on February 11th, 1650. Now, even though he was raised as Catholic, René Descartes, who had been summoned in 1649 to tutor Queen Christina, was regarded with suspicion by many of his theological co-religionists. His theories were viewed as incompatible with the belief of transubstantiation, in which the bread and wine served during the Eucharist literally became the flesh and blood of Christ. Villague was convinced that his metaphysics were more in line with Calvinist heresy, said Ebert. The theory of foul play has been greeted with caution by scholars since Descartes' death on February 11, 1650. Pneumonia has been blamed for robbing the world of the so-called father of modern philosophy. Oh, it was just pneumonia. But he dies really young, and he dies in all of a sudden circumstances. And he wasn't getting along with Queen Christina. Queen Christina, I bet she was a peach. So, let's see. Ebert rejects this as incompatible with the facts. In a letter written after his patient's death, Descartes' Dr. Van Woelen described having found something wrong, which Ebert believes to be blood in the philosopher's urine. There's something in your urine. What is this? Well, that's not a symptom of pneumonia. It's a symptom of poisoning, chiefly arsenic, said Ebert, and that Descartes asked his doctor to prescribe an emetic. What conclusion could be drawn other than the philosopher who is well acquainted with the medicine of his day? An emetic is wine mixed with tobacco. It's essentially something to make you puke. It was something to make you puke, so to drink tobacco so you would throw up because he thought he had been poisoned. So Descartes himself thought he had been poisoned. Descartes apparently started giving lessons to Queen Christina after her birthday 3 times a week at 5 a.m. in her cold and draughty castle. Soon it became clear they did not like each other. She did not like his mechanical philosophy, nor did he appreciate her interest in ancient Greek. By January 15th, 1650, Descartes had seen Christina only 4 or 5 times. On February 1st, he caught a cold which quickly turned into a serious respiratory infection, and he died on February 11th. The cause of death was pneumonia, according to Chenot, but pneumonia, according to the Dr. Van Woelen, who was not allowed to bleed him. The winter seemed to have been mild, except for the second half of January, which was harsh. The winter seems to have been mild, but he said that it was harsh, but maybe the remark was more about the intellectual climate than it was about the weather. Eventually, he dies, and then they try to turn him into a saint by publishing selectively his letters. In 1663, the Pope placed his works on the index of prohibited books. So the Pope said, nah, fuck you, Descartes. And in 1666, his remains were taken to France and buried in the Saint Etienne du Mont. 1671, Louis XIV prohibited all the lectures in Cartesianism. Then he's removed to the Pantheon. So what is Cartesianism? What did Rene Descartes do that was so bad that he needed to die? They poisoned the host, the Eucharist, and then he, ate the Eucharist, ate the fucking arsenic. So whoever's preparing your food, be very, very cautious. If they're preparing your food, make them eat it first. You eat it first. Okay, it's not poison. Rene Descartes, he was only 53 years old when he had died. He was famous for the saying, I think, therefore I am. Now, you have Immanuel Kant, the critique of pure reason. Well, what can we actually know about ourselves? Descartes started doubting everything. He started doubting whether we could see, whether we can hear, whether we could taste, whether we could feel. Let's take all the 5 senses and say that they all can be deceived. And then you've got dreams. So your dreams, even your perception, you can't even trust your own perception. So if you can't trust your own perception, then what can we know for sure? And when he was doubting, he could not doubt that he was doubting. And therefore, Rene Descartes realized he was a thinking substance. At the very least, he was a thinking substance. I think, therefore I am. I think, I doubt, therefore I exist. So reason, we know that we exist. At the very least, we know that we're real. The idea, essentially they had disagreements. They weren't, the Queen Christina wanted him as a mentor, so she was the one that invited, Rene Descartes to her castle. But for long periods, Queen Christina didn't have any time to see him at all. When she did have time to see him, he had to adapt to her early morning habits. He would have to walk at 5 in the morning in the chilly royal castle just for philosophical discussions. And he was, in his whole life, used to getting up at 11 o'clock. And he winds up dying a few months later. So is Sweden so damn cold that, Rene Descartes' 53-year-old body couldn't adjust, or there wasn't any immune? Perhaps. I don't know. This is what, 1600s or something? So the idea was that it was an arsenic-laced communion wafer given to him by a Catholic priest. That's what Rene Descartes, the theory postulates that he got. So the whole sort of controversy is that Queen Christina had Catholic tendencies, and therefore she was going to convert to the Catholic faith. And that's essentially how the Catholic Church was able to get all this power, based on illusion. They had the monopoly on morality and on God, and if the divine right of kings, you can get God on your side, you can get the religious people on your side too. And so it was just a game that they would play with these kings and queens, and they would say, well, we take, we decide all the things religious, and you decide all the things political. Being friends with all these kings and queens, they were able to expand their domain, the Roman Catholic, the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire lasted for about 1,000 years, and they were very much into the Inquisition. So Queen Christina had Catholic tendencies, and even though he was raised a Catholic priest that Ebert mentions is Jacques Viogue, V-I-O-G-U-E. And so he's saying that Jacques Viogue knew of Queen Christina's Catholic tendencies, and since Descartes was not himself a Catholic, or not a very good Catholic, because he was regarded with suspicion by the Catholic Church, since his theories were viewed as incompatible with the belief of transubstantiation, which is bullshit. Transubstantiation is bullshit. According to Ebert, Viogue was convinced that Descartes' metaphysics were more in line with Calvinist heresy. So he was afraid that he was going to take Queen Christina back to the Calvinist, the Protestant way, and not to the Catholic way. So he killed him. He fucking poisoned him with arsenic. And that's how it was done. So Descartes, we could put an asterisk by it, but that's, so far we got Bruno was killed, Descartes. It shouldn't be a shock, really, to anybody that the Catholic Church has killed so many people. In the 1,200 years when they were doing all the Inquisitions, they killed over 75 million people, according to thecuttingedge.org. So 75 million people, that's a fucking genocide, okay? And, can you kill an idea? Can you kill paganism? Can you kill atheism? Can you kill science? Can you kill everything that isn't Catholicism? There's this man here, I talked about John Hughes, which I'll mention here in a second, but John Wycliffe, he was in the 1300s, and the Catholic Church hated John Wycliffe so much. He was just like John Hughes, saying, let's interpret the Bible for ourselves. And that's basically the essence of the Protestant Reformation. We can interpret the Bible for ourselves. We don't need the Pope and other motherfuckers telling us how to live our life. And he started calling the Pope the Antichrist, and the entire church the Antichrist. John Wycliffe, actually, he just dies, right? And thankfully, right, to the Catholic Church, like, oh, thank you, he just died. But they didn't want, that wasn't good enough. After he died, they went ahead, they burned all of his books, and they tried to burn as many as they could on the continent, in England, everywhere. And they excommunicated, consigned to everlasting flames from the moment of his death. In 1428, Pope Martin V had dug him up and burned at the stake. So they hated John Wycliffe so much. They waited like 30 years later or so. They waited many years later after his death, dug his bones up, and then burned him at the stake. So I don't know if that's just... isn't that a crucifixion? Aren't you crucifying people? Don't you see the contradiction there when you're got the monopoly on what's moral and ethical and what's right, and then you're burning people at the stake? Hell, why don't you just crucify them? Just nail them to a... I also feel like there's the thou shalt not kill, right? And that's like a rule for Christians. Love thy neighbor. Not just love your neighbor, but love your enemy. Love your enemy as yourself. I gotta admit, those ideas are pretty fucking revolutionary, right? Love your enemy. Let them do whatever they want to you, because only by love can we heal the world. After John Wycliffe, the theorist of the classical Reformation, John Huss is considered the first church reformer. He lived before Luther, Calvin, and Zwingli. So he was executed in July 6, 1415, at 45 years old by the Catholic Church. He was burned at the stake for heresy against the doctrines of the Catholic Church, including on ecclesiology, the Eucharist, and other theological topics. So a century later, as many 90% of the inhabitants of the Czech lands were... John Huss is actually a huge figure. He was born in the Kingdom of Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic. I'm Bohemian. I'm part Bohemian with my... Damasco bloodlines. They got Damasco bloodlines, and he was Bohemian. He wrote Bohemian on his, immigration forms. So John Huss was killed in 1415, and then there were 5 consecutive papal crusades between 1420 and 1431. So for about 20 years, 15 years, they became known as the Hussite Wars, because a lot of these people were followers of John Huss or believed that they could interpret the Bible for themselves, but the Catholic Church says, fuck that. So a century later, 90% of everybody in the Czech lands were non-Catholic, and some still follow the teachings of John Huss and his successors. So the Catholic Church actually wound up losing a lot by murdering. I thought it was crazy, actually, how a lot of these words are very smart, intelligent, to say God is a prick. Well, that's blasphemy. That's blasphemy. that's such a strong word to say, just because I said some words in syllables in an order you didn't like, then that means I need to be punished for it. The history of the Catholic Church, ever since Christianity was legal in 315 AD, more and more pagan temples were destroyed by Christian mobs. Pagan priests were killed. St. Patrick, he kills all the Druids in Ireland, all the natives. And I don't know if he did it himself, but it was under his leadership, right? He has the knowledge of civilization. He was bringing Christianity to these pagan Druid people. And it happened just over and over. Between 315 and 6th century, thousands of pagan believers were slain. The sanctuary of Ashulap in Aegea, the temple of Aphrodite in Golgotha, Aphaca in Lebanon, the Heliopolis. The Christian priest, Mark of Arethusa or Sarah of Heliopolis, were famous as temple destroyers. Pagan services became punishable by death in 356 AD. So once Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, you couldn't celebrate anything else. It was the official religion. Be Christian or else be killed. Christian Emperor Theodosius even had children executed because they'd been playing with the remains of pagan statues. They're killing children, right? Well, you're playing with a pagan statue, so you must die. And he followed meticulously all Christian teachings, right? Emperor Theodosius had children executed, right? So in 6th century, Hypatia of Alexandria was torn to pieces with glass fragments by hysterical Christian mob led by a Christian minister named Peter in a church in 415. So, if you're going to murder somebody, why not do it in the church, right? In the sanctuary of all that is good and holy. In the early 4th century, the philosopher Sopaterus was executed on demand of Christian authorities. So, we're killing a philosopher, Sopaterus. We're killing Hypatia of Alexandria. And then, we killed thousands more. So how many of those people would have known, gravity or the cure for cancer or, millions of other scientific discoveries? They could have been useful, and we could have actually furthered, the success of mankind in our technological achievements and helped us all to survive and helped us all to get along. Even Charlemagne in 1782 had 4,500 Saxons. They were beheaded, 4,500 Saxons. And I want to say Anglo-Saxons were the Germanic tribes, but then they went to England, and then there was the Norse and the Celtic and the Saxons, and then there were the English, and then, most people in America were of English descent, but that means they're Norse, which is Scandinavian, and Viking, and Celtics, which is Irish and Druids, and then the Celtics, the Norse, and the Saxons, which are Germanic tribes. So, the English are actually a composite of lots of different people. Peasants of Steeding, Germany, unwilling to pay suffocating church taxes, 5,000 to 11,000 men, women, and children were slain in 1234 near Altenasch, Germany. The Battle of Belgrade, 1456, 80,000 Turks were slaughtered. 15th century Poland, 1,019 churches, 18,000 villages were plundered by the Knights of the Order. Victims are unknown. So, and we even talked about the Crusades, and then this list just kind of goes on and on and on. We haven't talked about the Crusades. We haven't talked about any of the sort of, recent Jesus, Christian, witches, burning witches, right? That was an American thing. We burned witches. You get out of line, shut your mouth, now you're a witch. You're burned to death. And the slave trade, the Ku Klux Klan, Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, Russian czars, the Inquisitions, the Crusades, just constantly. Just if you don't believe the same way we believe, we kill you. And that's been happening since essentially the beginnings of the teachings of Christ, or at least in the 300s, when the Catholic Church became the official religion of the Roman Empire. So, there's a ton of religious wars, and there is some sort of schism in between Catholics and Protestants. You have Copernicus, right, of Copernicanism, the one who says that the sun is the center of the solar system, the earth is not the center of the universe. He actually dedicated his book, Revolutions of the Heavenly Orbs, to Pope Paul III. And he said, if men who are ignorant in mathematics pretend to condemn my book because of certain passages of Scripture which they distort to suit themselves, I despite their vain attacks. Cal Cagnini, who died in 1540, would not have publicly taught at Ferrara that the heaven stands, but the earth moves. But if the church were not hostile to purely scientific innovations, Luther and Melanchthon was not so liberal. In his Table Talk, Luther says, men pay heed to an astrologer who contends that if the earth that moves, Luther says, if a man yearns for reputation as a profound scientist, he should invent some new system. This madman would subvert the whole science of astronomy, but Scripture tells us that Joshua bade the sun and not the earth to stand still. And that's actually, true. In Joshua 10, verse 12, it was then when the Lord delivered up the Amorites to the Israelites that Joshua prayed to the Lord and said in the presence of Israel, sun, stand still at Gibeon, moon in the valley of Aijalon. The sun stood still, the moon stayed, while the nation took vengeance on its foes. This is recorded in the Book of Jashar. The sun halted halfway across the heavens. Not for an entire day did it press on. Never before or since was there a day like this when the Lord obeyed the voice of a man. For the Lord fought for Israel. Then Joshua and all Israel returned to the camp at Gilgal. Martin Luther believed. So we got a small list here. We got Bruno, who was killed. We have Sopater, who was killed. We got Hypatia, who was killed. These are philosophers, scientists. And so it makes sense for the scientific community to form their own sort of Illuminati, for their own clique. We believe in reality. They want to believe in insanity, so fuck them. And so that's where the Illuminati comes from. But they weren't all against science, and I'm going to do another video after this sort of defending some Catholics, did a good job. But this guy I want to talk about, Domenico Scandella. He was he lived in the 1500s, also known as Minocchia. So Minocchia was a miller from Montereal, Italy, who in the 16th century was tried by the Inquisition for his unorthodox religious views, burnt at the stake for heresy. So Petros, who was killed, a philosopher, Hypatia, who was killed, and Bruno, who was killed, and now we have Minocchio. Minocchio was burned at the stake. Again, burned at the stake, right? Just like that John Wycliffe, and John Hughes, and Bruno. They were all burned at the stake. I don't know what the fuck burning people at the stake was all about. Maybe it was the most embarrassing or something, the most horrendous. They really wanted them to feel the pain, right? Just like that's what Jesus would have done. What would Jesus do? Oh, he'd probably burn people at the stake. So this is Minocchio, and he'd been banished from the town for brawling, so I guess he got into a fight. He learned to read a number of contemporary works on religion and history. He developed his religious views that departed from Catholic orthodoxy. He was first tried for heresy in 1583, tried in 1583, then said, oh, okay, I was lying, 1584, but then spent 20 months in prison in Concordia. He was released in 1586. Right, a year or two later, he claimed to have been reformed. Hey, I've accepted Jesus. I've been reformed. Right, just like that one cannibal. What the fuck was that guy's name? Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey Dahmer. He's a reformed Christian now. So Jeffrey Dahmer's probably in heaven since he's accepted God. as his all-in-one. Like I said, in fact, I knew somebody like that. They said it didn't matter what they did. They could be a bad and shitty person, but if they just believed in God, they would go to heaven. Okay, so you could be the devil here on earth, but you're going to be in heaven. We're going to meet Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey fucking Dahmer is in fucking heaven. Okay, if you believe that, then fuck your religion. So, let's see. Another 20 months in prison in Concordia, released in 1586. He claimed to have reformed. So he pretended like he had reformed, and then he was able to get out. And Minuccio was on house arrest, right? Just like Galilee, he had to wear a sign of a burning cross on his garment as a visible sign of his crimes. So he's being branded. In 1598, he was arrested again as a lapsed heretic, since he continued to speak to many people about his thoughts, which is a crime. You cannot have thoughts of your own in the Catholic-dominated Europe. In 1599, he was declared a heresiarch and was executed by burning. During his trial, he argued that the only sin was to harm one's neighbor, and that to blasphemy caused no harm to anyone but the blasphemer. He went so far as to say that Jesus was born of man and Mary was not a virgin, and that the Pope had no power given to him from God, and simply exemplified the qualities of a good man, and that Christ had not died to redeem humanity. What? 1300s, you had King Philip IV of Spain and the Templars, Pope Clement. They were fighting against one another, Pope Clement and King Philip IV of Spain. Philip accused them of the most atrocious sins imaginable at the time. So these are just, the Catholic Inquisition. So apostasy, that's what the Muslims do. If you try to get out of the Muslim religion, they'll kill you. And that's what they were doing in Christianity. Christianity was doing the exact same thing. So you could have been killed for apostasy. You could have been killed for heresy, right? You're a heretic. You say God don't exist, you're a heretic. Fucking burn them at the stake. Idolatry, if you were worshiping idols. If you worshipped idols, then you could be put to death. But isn't that what Jesus on the cross is? Right? What about money and the golden calf and fucking Trump and these Templar? I want to say this, the Templar Knights, but I'm not for sure. 1300s. You could check out the names Pope Clement and Philip IV. But you have essentially they are punishing each other, and they were punishing them because they're not Christians, and they said, well, you can punish them without making them bleed, so they're put on the rack, stretched until their shoulders were dislocated, and some had their testicles crushed in vises, which caused them to bleed profusely, but internally, so no blood was spilled, right? Some were shackled to the dungeon floors and had their feet roasted to the bone in furnaces. This is what the Catholics were doing, and what they did with Galileo. It shouldn't be ignored. I think it's what this Pope has been saying. Actually, I like this Pope, and what this Pope has been saying. This is the direction that the Catholic Church should go. They're spiritual, but in terms of science, they're at the mercy. Joan of Arc was killed by the Catholic Church, and St. Patrick was at odds with the Catholic Church. But essentially what the Church does is they co-opt, and they say, no, Joan of Arc was a saint. Patrick was a saint. He was one of ours, right? Can't beat him, join him, and so they make him a saint after they had died. Essentially, with Galileo. Oh, yeah, there was also a William Tyndale. He translated the Bible into English, and he was killed by the Catholic Church October 6, 1536, just for translating the Bible into English. So I guess my closing thoughts about Galileo. Galileo had discovered, just with his own little telescope, that he saw moons going around Jupiter. If there are moons that are going around Jupiter, then that means everything doesn't revolve around Earth. Right? There's something revolving around Jupiter, and what does that mean? Right? That was heliocentrism. So you cannot ignore the moons going around. Story about Galileo, and I don't know if it's 100% true, but the story has lasting impact. Okay, so essentially they're trying to make Galileo say, what you said is bullshit. The Earth is the center. Now say it, and curse what you just said before. And he eventually put his hands behind his back. He crossed his fingers, and he said something to the effect of, fine, the Earth does not move around the sun. And then under his breath he muttered, "E per si muove," which is, and yet it moves. And yet the Earth moves. So we don't know for 100%. He also said the Bible tells you how to go to heaven. It does not tell you how the heavens go. So these are clever phrases which essentially, defend fucking Galileo. Yeah. You want to say that the Earth doesn't revolve around the sun? It moves. We know that it moves at the very least. So you don't know if it goes around the sun. Well, that's your fucking ignorance.